Why is it that growing up has this distinct feeling? An inescapable anxiety that's not inherently negative, but still defined by a definitive sense of angst, a sense of confusion. And why is it that this sense seems to be an almost universally understood feeling? A texture that evokes the pangs of emerging from naivety into adult experience, that remains recognisable to all of us, in spite of the incomprehensibly large disparities between human existence. It's a feeling that is almost indescribable, yet perfectly recaptured time and time again within the cinematic form.
Not that these images, the ones you've just been seeing, are particularly perfect.
If anything, this just proves how commonplace and universal this specific feeling of growing up is. So much so that even I could evoke it filmically to a certain extent. But this specific emotional state has been captured filmically so often and so well that it has prompted the creation of its own genre. This, of course, being the coming of age film. Now, we all know that these films are a prevalent cinematic tenet and have remained popular for quite some time, continuing to capture the experience of growing up in all walks of life through a series of decades, crystallising that universal texture, that journey of self-discovery, of wrestling with teenage angst. Of course, this universal texture is based upon a sense of nostalgia, looking back at childhood and the specifics of this experience. However, there is a slight problem with this, as these specific notions of nostalgia begin to compromise this idea of universality, especially when considering the often westernized perspective taken by these films. You see, the coming-of-age film often depicts nostalgia far removed from the experience of an individual living outside of the West, and more specifically outside of America. This sense of nostalgia is also racially specific. Daniela Bergen demonstrates this in her text Coming of Age in the Hood, the diasporic youth film and questions of genre. Here she explores how youth films depicting the journeys of protagonists who are immigrants or whose parents are immigrants are not afforded the same privileges as those protagonists native to the typically Western setting. She suggests that these protagonists are faced with the search for ethnic and cultural belonging, as well as the search for personal identity, and therefore the films they inhabit should technically be categorised as a different genre to the typical westernised coming-of-age film. Certainly there are examples that negate this limited perspective, but they are few and far between, and still don't serve to encapsulate the full range of potential experience. Evidently, this is a topic of exploration that warrants addressing in a video essay of its own right. However, I would still argue that despite their generally Americanized and privileged nostalgic focus, the coming-of-age film does have an emotive resonance in a global sense, one that appeals to a universal nostalgic experience. This emotive resonance existing in the form of teenage angst. Essentially, it is the thematic core of this genre of film.
It's so good.
A genre that is incredibly popular throughout society and has been for a number of decades.
What?
Yet, in of itself, teenage angst is an emotional state that is neglected by the same society. An idea of feeling that otherwise has its significance repressed by the socially determined hierarchy of emotion, depicting it as a phase to be grown out of and forgotten, often parodied as an irrational set of behaviours and defined as no more than a short-acting biological function. This is an inarguable paradox. How can a genre as popular and well established within society as the coming-of-age film be concerned with an emotional state that is treated completely non-seriously by the same society? And what does this paradox suggest for us who perpetuate it and for the society in which it exists? But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves there, or at the very least I am. What I think we initially need to interpret from this paradox is that the coming-of-age film has more academic significance than you may initially think. Thank you. In a letter to a friend, Albert Camus once wrote that basically, at the very bottom of life, which seduces us all, there is only absurdity and more absurdity. Absurdity, as Camus described it, was the paradox that exists between our impulse as humans to ask ultimate questions and the impossibility of achieving any answers. In simplistic terms, this means that basically there is no inherent meaning or purpose to life, or at least Camus believes so. And this idea, as much as he would protest being named as such, forms the basis of existentialist philosophy. However, this is not as depressively gloomy as you may initially think, as Camus also writes of absurdity. In fact, in the very same sentence in which he describes it as this all-consuming seducer, that maybe it's what gives us our joy for living, because the only thing that can defeat absurdity is lucidity. Hold on, cut. This isn't working. Excuse me? You're not making any sense. Well, the studio won't have this at all. Look, how can a purposeless life be anything other than miserable? Well, what Camus seems to be suggesting is that an awareness and acceptance of the absurd is actually a form of freedom. Freedom to look the meaninglessness of life square in the face and, in spite of it, construct your own meaning, a personal purpose that can allow for a truly authentic existence, as Nietzsche would put it. Yeah. That's all well and good, but what's it got to do with the coming-of-age film? To establish personal drive strong enough to challenge the inherent meaninglessness of life, well, it requires an intense knowledge of the self. And this knowledge normally requires a journey of self-discovery to achieve. And this journey is fraught with distraction and pre-established purpose. Is anything of what I'm saying sounding familiar at all? Look, this intrinsic through line of logic that governs existentialist philosophy quite clearly reflects key thematic elements of the coming-of-age narrative. Does it? Yes, of course it. Look. Come on, I'll show you. Take Stand By Me, for example, a classic coming-of-age film that completely conforms to the tropes of the genre. It's a film that clearly depicts a personal journey, framed around the physical one, over which time the protagonist discovers a sense of self and a personal purpose. For the protagonist of this film, Gordy, this is storytelling, imparting a sense of feeling and emotional experience to his fellow man. Well, this is of course in a similar way to how my personal purpose is to learn and to educate. And yours is... Actually, what would you say yours is? Making money? Keeping the studio happy? Right, I think I understand why you might be misunderstanding me. Come on, let's go. Okay. You see, it's not simply the battle to find the self that makes these films existential in their logic. It's also what this battle is taking place against. This being the notion of bad faith.
Well, what's that then?
Well, it's a concept that Jean-Paul Sartre came up with. It describes a mode of living in which an individual isn't true to their authentic self, in which they have negated the personal search for their own purpose and have instead accepted a purpose that's been assigned to them by an external force. Sartre describes a waiter who is too good at their job and only concerned with the proficiency of their work as an individual who's living in bad faith, as they are an individual who's living as a waiter first before they're living as themselves.
Do you need anything, sir?
No, thank you.
And you, sir, would you like anything?
Jesus, where do you come from? No, thank you. No. Anyway, where was I? We can see bad faith at play in these coming of age films. But I am gonna have to show you again. Come on. We can see Gordy battling against the forces of bad faith in Stand By Me, as he is pressured by his parents and the wider community around him to be more like his late brother, the star athlete. These external forces want him to assume this pre-established purpose as opposed to accepting and exploring the absurd to find his own personal purpose.
You play football?
Hmm?
You play football?
No.
What do you do?
I don't know.
This conflict with bad faith is not exclusive to Stand By Me. It's a common motif of the coming-of-age film. For example, in Rebel Without a Cause, our protagonist Jim faces bad faith in the form of pressure to conform to suburban life. This conformity is embodied by his father, a servile, emasculated member of the middle class, and a reflection of Nietzsche's The Last Man.
Stan, don't. I mean, you should. Don't. What do you.
We can also see bad faith demonstrated by individuals who, rather than accepting an inauthentic purpose, refuse to accept or develop a purpose at all. This is demonstrated by the gangs of kids in Rebel Without a Cause, tempting Jim to join them with their hedonistic risk-taking, which eventually leads to the first death of the film.
There he is! I see him! Look! Look over there! I see him! I see him!
None of us could breathe. Somewhere under those bushes was the rest of Ray Brower.
Death is another essential theme of existentialism, as wrestling with the absurdity of life inevitably means confronting the fact that at one point it will end. To quote Camus, death is there as the only reality. This theme is a consistent feature throughout the genre, as are all these existentialist thematic precedents, such as the prospect of bad faith and inauthentic living standing in a protagonist's way, or the constant anxiety and angst that underpins existentialist awareness, and of course the search for personal purpose and authentic living. You know what? I think I get it.
You do?
The narrative and aesthetic tropes definitely match up with the philosophical logic. You're right there. There's definitely a sort of uncanny connection between the two. Definitely something we could shoot, I think. But I still do have one question though.
Yeah, of course. Ask away.
So what? Well, what do you mean? I mean, so what if the narrative and the aesthetics match up with the philosophy? You know, coming of age films are slightly more philosophically significant than we thought before. Like, who cares?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, obviously. Well, what I mean is that.
God, I don't know. Yes, thank you, boys. I think I can take it from here now.
I don't know.
Ooh, sorry, I had to leave you with them two for a little bit. However, you are now officially up to speed, and I can continue discussing that paradox that I was talking to you about earlier, about how teenage angst, despite being the emotional and thematic centre of these films, is socially disregarded, whilst at the same time these films hold general popular appeal. You see, since we've established that these films have philosophical significance more than simply being popular, I don't think it would be too large a leap to suggest that teenage angst has more social significance than the disregard it is often treated with. Here, let me show you.
Well, you seem to know more than anybody else around here.
Well, if you only knew how little I know about the things that matter.
What these films seem to suggest through their protagonists' existential journeys of self-discovery is that the teenage angst that often provokes them to engage on these journeys is more than simply a state of emotional instability brought about by the effects of puberty, suggesting that the inception of this emotion within an individual coincides with more than simply hormonal changes, but also, I would argue, an awakening existential awareness.
You're tearing me apart!
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again!
Do these films not depict the time within an individual's life in which they start to question things that up until now had been unquestionable in their authority? The fallibility of parents, for example, no longer the perfect beings they were once viewed as in early childhood, or the questionable logic of educational institutions in what they decide is of significance for young people to learn. And of course, what comes after this, the world of work and the often socially determined expectations here. Therefore, I would argue that these films depict how the development of teenage angst also leads to a developing awareness that none of these external bodies of organised authority could provide the individual with an authentic personal purpose to their life. This bridling existential awareness also provides abundant explanation for the negative tropes of behaviour that are associated with teenage angst.
Mom!
You can't even pass your driver's test.
Because you wouldn't let me practice
The way
enough.
that you work, or the way that you don't work, you're not even worth state tuition, Christine.
My name is Ladybird.
Well, actually, it's not, and it's ridiculous.
Call me
because your name
Ladybird
is
like
Christine.
you said you would.
You should just go to City College. You know, with your work ethic, just go to City College and then to jail, and then back to City College, and then maybe you'd learn to pull yourself up and not expect everybody to do everything.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Doing so in a far more compelling fashion than to simply explain it as the results of a biological function. A simple Google search of the phrase teenage angst will reveal a number of articles aimed at concerned parents, the headlines of which read something along the lines of, "Is my teenager suffering from teenage angst or depression?" The articles going on to list the fine line that exists between determining which the child is suffering from. But does this in itself not suggest the increased significance of teenage angst? If it was as unimportant and dismissible as society often suggests it is, then why is it so difficult to discern from an incredibly serious mental health issue, one that has only been rising in recent years? Well, if teenage angst and existential awareness are inherently linked, and an engagement with existential awareness means searching the self for a personal purpose, then an acceptance of the significance of teenage angst would lead to a decrease in the negative effects of bad faith, as less people would accept externally assigned purposes, and therefore individuals would become objectively more difficult to control. Society's degrading attitude towards teenage angst could be seen as an attempt to prevent existential awareness, using the difficult nature of constructing an individual purpose to its advantage, offering more comfortable pre-assigned alternatives, and suggesting that this is the more mature path to take in order to prevent individuals from questioning external bodies of authority. The idea that social norms repress freedom of thought may sound radical to some, but really it's not. It's an idea that existed in existential thought since the mid-19th century, as can be seen in this quote from Soren Kierkegaard. "When I was young, I forgot how to laugh in the cave of Trophonius. When I was older, I opened my eyes and beheld reality, at which I began to laugh, and since then I have not stopped laughing. I saw that the meaning of life was to secure a livelihood, and that its goal was to attain a high position, that love's rich dream was marriage with an heiress, that friendship's blessing was help in financial difficulties, that wisdom was what the majority assumed it to be, that enthusiasm consisted in making a speech, that it was courage to risk the loss of $10, that kindness consisted in saying, "You are welcome" at the dinner table, that piety consisted in going to communion once a year. This I saw, and I laughed. Ultimately, the coming-of-age film not only demonstrates a reflection of existential philosophy, but also highlights the significance of living authentically and finding a personal purpose. These films champion the significance of teenage angst as an essential challenge that comes with facing the absurd, refusing to downgrade its significance in the same way society does. We can see how these films demonstrate the significance of this authentic living through common aesthetic tropes, as they often end with a strikingly similar mise-en-scène, with our protagonists often finding themselves on a beach, looking out at the sea in front of them. A fitting visual metaphor for the long, turbulent, and unknown future that awaits an individual ready to battle the absurd throughout their life. Then, they turn to camera, looking directly at their audience as if to ask you what you want, to ask you if you're willing to continue down a life that has been decided for you, or if you're willing to face the absurd, if you're willing to create your own purpose, if you're really willing to come of age.
Gucci.
Mm-hmm.